Okay, so what is the Gann limit or the State Appropriations Limit, sometimes referred to as the SAL? In the past few years, but particularly in 2022, lots of people in and around the California state capitol have been talking about the Gann limit or the State Appropriations Limit, again, often referred to as the SAL, S-A-L. So what is the SAL or Gann limit? Basically, if the state has revenues above the SAL over 2 consecutive years, then our state constitution requires the state to divide the excess revenues between rebates to taxpayers and additional spending on schools. The SAL or the Gann limit was enacted by the state's voters in November 1979 as Proposition 4, just 1 year after voters had adopted Proposition 13, and the voters had a continuing interest in limiting state and local government spending. And basically, Prop 4, again adopted in November 1979 by the state's voters, capped spending at the 1978-79 fiscal year levels, which is adjusted annually based upon changes in population and cost of living. Now, while most state appropriations are subject to the SAL, there are certain types of appropriations that are exempt, such as capital outlays, local government subventions, and debt service. So what are the constitutional provisions here? The SAL or the Gann limit is contained in Article 13B of the California State Constitution. This appropriations limit is calculated then pursuant to Government Code Section 7902. Although it was originally adopted in 1979, these constitutional provisions were amended by the voters in June 1990 in Proposition 111. As amended by Prop 111, the appropriations limit of each entity of government is now the appropriations limit that was set in the 1986-87 fiscal year, again with adjustments annually made for changes in population and inflation or cost of living. Article 13B, Section 1 provides that the total annual appropriation subject to limitation of the state and of each local government cannot exceed the appropriations limit of the entity of government for the prior year, adjusted for the change in the cost of living and the change in population, except in instances that are otherwise provided. In Section 2 of Article 13B, it specifies that 50% of all revenues received by the state in a fiscal year and in the fiscal year immediately following it in excess of the amount that may be appropriated by the state in compliance with that fiscal year and the immediate following fiscal year has to be allocated to education funding, and 50%, quote, shall be returned by a revision of tax rates or fee schedules within the next 2 subsequent fiscal years, unquote. Section 4 of Article 13B requires the appropriations limit for any fiscal year to be adjusted in specific instances, including in the event that the financial responsibility of providing services is transferred in whole or in part from one entity of government to another, or from an entity of government to a private entity, or in the event of an emergency that's declared either by the legislature or an entity of government, or in the event of an emergency that's been declared by the California governor. Section 5 of Article 13B provides that each entity of government may establish contingency, emergency, unemployment, reserve, retirement, sinking funds, trust, or similar funds as it deems reasonable, and contributions to any funds to the extent that these contributions are derived from the proceeds of taxes do constitute appropriations that are subject to the limitation that's in existence during that year of contribution. And neither withdrawals from any of these funds nor expenditures of these withdrawals or transfers between these different funds will then constitute appropriation subject to limitation. By the way, it's in section 9 of Article 13B that specifies 5 appropriations subject to limitation for each entity of government are not included. Okay, so it defines what doesn't constitute an appropriation subject to limitation. And those include appropriations for debt service, appropriations required to comply with mandates of the courts or the federal government, for appropriations of any special districts which existed on January 1, 1978, appropriations for all qualified capital outlay projects as defined by the legislature, and appropriations of revenue which are derived from the portion of the motor vehicle taxes for streets and highways at a rate of more than 9 cents per gallon. And then section 12 also excludes from the appropriations subject to limitation definition appropriations from the tobacco tax that was enacted in 1988. Section 13 excludes revenues from the Children and Families First Act of 1998. Section 14 excludes the 2016 tobacco tax. And section 15 excludes from the definition again of appropriation subject to limitation from the road maintenance and rehabilitation account that was created by the 2017 Road Repair and Accountability Act. So what are these? Again, were the constitutional provisions of the Gann limit or the SAL. What about the statutory provisions? There are also provisions related again to the SAL in the government code. They're found in section 7900 to 7914. These are in Division 9 of Title I, and Division 9 was added in 1980 by Chapter 1205. Some of the provisions of Division 9 include in Section 7900, there are 2 legislative findings and declarations. Basically, that the purpose of Division 9 is to provide for the effective and efficient implementation of Article 13B of the California Constitution. Section 7901 defines the term change in California per capita personal income, as well as change in population for a local agency or a school district or community college district. Section 7901 also defines the terms local agency, school district, local jurisdiction, revenues, and proceeds of taxes. Section 7909 requires the Department of Finance no later than May 1 of each year to notify each local agency of the change in the cost of living or change in California per capita personal income, whichever is less, as well as the population for each local agency for the prior calendar year. Then Section 7910 of the Government Code requires the governing body of each local jurisdiction to annually, by a resolution adopted by that body, establish its appropriation limit and make other necessary determinations for the following fiscal year pursuant to the provisions of Article 13B of the California Constitution. And this has to be done either at a regularly scheduled meeting of the local jurisdiction or a specially noticed meeting to do so. A couple of other government code sections here. 7911 authorizes a local jurisdiction to return excess revenues by granting a tax credit or refund, or even by providing a temporary suspension of tax or fee schedules. In Section 7912, the governor is required to annually include in the budget, as he or she submits to the legislature, an estimate of the state's appropriations limit for that budget year. And of course, that estimate then goes through the regular legislative budget process, and it's actually set forth in the annual budget bill. And then finally, Section 7914 defines an appropriation for a qualified capital outlay project to mean an appropriation for a fixed asset, including land and construction, with a useful life of 10 or more years and a value of $100,000 or more. So what are the practical implications here? Basically, what does all this mean? Well, our legislative analyst explains that the state would either need to reduce taxes or issue refunds to taxpayers and make additional payments to schools for any amounts in excess of the SAL or the Gann limit. In addition, the LAO says that without significant budget changes, the state likely does not have the capacity for new services or program expansions. So what's the room under the SAL? Well, the room under the State Appropriations Limit or Gann limit has been reduced in the last couple of years because there's been such tremendous growth in both personal income tax revenues, and Prop 98 required spending on schools has also grown more quickly. And so the LAO has proposed several options for how the legislature can take action. Of course, it may take no action, and then the SAL sets forth the division 50-50 of those excess revenues. Again, so you're either going to make tax refunds and allocate the excess revenue to schools, or the legislature could try and increase spending on certain items that are excluded from the SAL. They could reduce taxes so that there aren't excess revenues coming into the state. They could reduce spending on exempt purposes such as local fiscal relief and infrastructure. They could make new statutory changes to the SAL. And of course, they could ultimately go to the voters and make constitutional changes to Article 13B. Because of the recent growth in revenues in the state, addressing the SAL or the Gann limit is probably going to become an ever more important discussion in future budget negotiations. And so just be aware that because there are 2 years to determine how much the SAL has been exceeded, if revenues are estimated to drop in future years, the entire amount that becomes excess may not actually get distributed if there's a reduction in revenues, as we're beginning to see in the fall and summer of 2022.